And here it is, FunMaster Mike versus Tani, the rematch for all of the pawns on this green earth. Well, Tani wanted to play black again, so yeah, if he wants to give me white, I'll take it. And I landed the first punch with e4, but actually we had what we call a theoretical discussion. He played his exact same Owen's defense. Now, let's see which side made a different idea first. Okay, I grabbed the center. Bishop d3. I already explained this idea in game number 1. He played e6, queen e2, very similar to game 1. After knight f6, I guarded with knight to d2. As you might recall in game 1, I want to keep my c2 pawn with some freedom of movement. I want to get that pawn to c3 in certain situations. In fact, he made the first new idea here. Whereas in game 1, the knight came out to block his own c-pawn. This time he challenged the center more quickly by playing pawn c5, and I kind of like the idea. Okay, I played c3. I want to keep my snow plow intact. He played d5, but I'm already guarding this pawn enough time, so I can ignore him for the moment and just play knight to f3. Pretty simple so far. I'm just finishing my development. All right, here comes Tani, knight to c6. He's attacking my center. Now, I only had a couple seconds to think about this. This was yet another blitz game, but I had to decide, is my d-pawn actually in danger? You might notice in this position, if his pawn on d5 takes my pawn on e4, then his queen will make a discovered attack on the d4 pawn. So actually, my d4 pawn could be said to have 3 attackers if you count the pawn, the knight, and the queen. I only have 2 defenders. However, this type of idea is very similar to the French defense, and this is where FunMaster Mike's experience really came into play. There are times in the French defense where white gives away a pawn because after doing so, this diagonal to the king becomes a little bit too weak for black. So it was a bit of an intuition decision. That means I didn't quite calculate. I just kind of felt it was too dangerous for him to capture the pawn. And I decided to ignore my d4 pawn and just castle. Not because I don't love my d4 pawn. It's because my d4 pawn is going to give itself up in the spirit of a higher cause. All right, so he took on d4. I took back. He took on e4. That does create the discovered attack. Okay. Now, we all know how FunMaster Mike loves his bishop pairs, so I'm going to take on e4 with the knight, not with the bishop. He'd be able to destroy my bishop pair. Okay, so he took on d4 just as we expected. I took, he took. Now, I've already mentioned that this diagonal to the king is going to be the weak spot. So, do I check first or do I do some sort of introductory move? Well, it was really tempting to go ahead and give that check right away. But that gives black one additional defensive idea. His knight could go back to d7, and although I think I still have some good attack for my pawn deficit, he does get to keep his king on the starting square, maybe castle later on. So, it occurred to me that the best way to make sure his king was in danger was to trade knights first. Okay, now I actually thought he might take back with the g-pawn. Remember in game 1, where he took back with the g-pawn to get his rook over to the g-file and come attack me? I kind of thought that's what he was going to do. If he puts his rook on g8, he has a double attack on g2. Okay, that takes a couple of moves to accomplish, but it's in the spirit of Tani. But instead, he captured back with the queen to keep his pawns intact. But now, I get to have a monster attack. In fact, I kind of feel like this is a position that Tani would love for the white pieces. He probably would have checkmated his opponent even quicker than I did to him. Probably he would have checkmated me in 5 moves, not 13 more moves like it took me. Okay, so I gave check with my bishop, and sadly, Tani's king has nowhere to go. I don't think the extra pawn is worth it. He doesn't want to go to the open file, of course, because then my rook would go to d1, and my rook would be attacking his king on d8. So his king decided to hide on e7 with a little bit of shelter, this pawn. Now comes, I think, the key decision. In fact, I think I spent about 30 seconds on this move, which out of a 5-minute game is a pretty sizable chunk of my time. The key thing here is to decide where to put my dark squared bishop. Now I know, viewers at home, you are so tempted to put the bishop on this diagonal because the king and the queen are both lined up. However, it's not that easy to get your bishop to g5. And even if you play a move like queen to h5, which I was considering, he can always guard this square with something. Maybe even play the move pawn to h6. So it wasn't that clear to me that I was going to be able to get my bishop to g5. Instead, if we back up, there's a different diagonal to put the bishop on. And there's one best way to get it there. I want to land on the a3 to f8 diagonal, and I played pawn to b3 to get that job done. Now, it looks like I hung my rook, but did I really? Did I really? Is FunMaster Mike tricking you? Well, I don't know if I'm tricking you, but I sure did not trick Tani. He did not play queen takes rook on a1, because if he did, then bishop to a3 check would be a discovered attack and he would lose his queen. So, going back to the game, he decided that after b3, he had to build a bit of a shelter for his king. Now, if you know this bishop's coming to a3, and you know your king is going to have to take a walk onto the open file, he played bishop to d5, building a little bit of a roof over his king's head. If I give check with my bishop, the king can hide on the d file. So what I did was I put my rook on d1 first. Going ahead and putting my rook on that file for when his king lands there, I'm also making a threat in the process. I can play rook takes bishop because the e6 pawn is pinned. Okay, so Tani to move, he played rook to d8 to defend his bishop, but that was actually his king's only escape square. After bishop to a3 check, it is serious trouble here. He only has one legal chess move. He has to put the rook in the way. Now, it might seem obvious I could just take his rook here, but that's almost too obvious. Right now, my bishop is actually better than the rook. I can take that rook whenever I feel like it. So, after about 30 more seconds, I came up with the move rook takes d5. Look at that blow. This pawn is pinned, and this rook is pinned. So amazingly, I can just take the bishop. Now, I almost thought I checkmated myself. Remember, Tani's awesome at tactics. Queen takes a1. Did I just hang a rook? Did I just hang checkmate? Actually, I didn't. My rook returns to d1. And although it looks like he has a double attack on my rook leading to checkmate, remember, this rook is pinned. It can't move. So even though your eyes are telling you that the rook can take on d1 and give checkmate, your brain had better overrule your eyes. So his queen has to move. He played queen to c3. And now the funny thing is I decided to save the check. Sometimes it's a better idea. Put that check in your pocket. Do not play bishop takes rook because the king would run away. Instead, rook takes is actually better because of the threat of discovered check, and I could pick off his queen. The king is coming on a walk to get off the dangerous diagonal, but it was a case of, here, kitty, kitty. I lured that king out to another unsafe diagonal. Bishop to b2 skewers the queen to the king. And here he has to give up the queen, which pretty much spells the end. The remaining moves, queen takes. Queen takes. The king tried to run back for shelter, but after rook check, the king is hopelessly stuck on the back rank. There's probably many ways to win. I think queen to d4 is technically just a little bit faster, but I saw that rook takes got the job done. And when his king ran away, a quick check, another check, and then we have the queen and the rook working together on the 7th rank for checkmate. Whew! I feel like I got really lucky in this game. I turned Tani's tactics against him. He was so good to see that he could win my d4 pawn, but he didn't stop to see what happens after he wins the d4 pawn. And a good lesson is that if your king's going to be stuck in the middle of the chessboard, you might want to think twice about capturing those free center pawns. So, luckily I got my wins in now, but I have no doubt if we play a rematch at the next year's US Chess Championship, Tani is going to be a much stronger guy to beat. I'm kind of already trying to figure out how to get out of that challenge.